At 1207A. Claire's phone lit up. Unknown number. She almost ignored it until a shaken voice whispered, "Claire, are you alone?" It was her CEO. Not powerful, not polished, afraid. Then he said the sentence that stopped her heart. "Tomorrow morning, they're going to blame you for something you didn't do. A patient data breach, a ready-made scapegoat, and by sunrise her name would be everywhere." She barely had time to breathe before he added quietly, "I'm outside." 3 soft knocks echoed through her house. On her porch stood the man who had never once looked at her in meetings, holding a plain white bakery box like an apology. This isn't a story about a woman breaking. It's about the moment she decided not to disappear. Let me take you back to where it all began. The kitchen clock blinked, 1207 a.m. in soft blue light, the kind that made the whole room feel colder than it really was. Claire Bennett sat alone at the small oak table she'd bought secondhand 5 years ago, smoothing out the corners of a stack of medical forms she still needed to verify. Her mug of chamomile tea had long gone lukewarm, but she cupped it anyway, letting its fading warmth settle into her palms. The house was quiet, too quiet, she thought. But quiet was normal on the weeks her son stayed with his father. Those were the weeks she worked, the extra overtime she never admitted she needed. Paperwork didn't judge. It didn't gossip. It didn't ask why she was still awake at midnight on a Wednesday. She reached for another form, rubbing the fatigue from her eyes. Outside, somewhere beyond the thin walls, a car rolled past on the wet street. The headlights cast a brief streak of silver across the kitchen floor, then vanished. Her phone buzzed. Claire glanced at the screen, expecting the usual late-night system alert from the hospital. Instead, she saw 2 words she hated more than bill reminders and voicemail icons. Unknown number. She exhaled, slow and steady. She had to rule her own private boundary after years of being pulled into crises that weren't hers. Never answer a call after midnight unless you know who's on the other end. She let it ring. The screen dimmed. Silence settled again, almost relieved. She reached for her pen. The phone buzzed a second time. Same number. Same insistence. A prickle crawled along her arms. She wasn't a fearful woman. Life had already thrown bigger things at her than a mysterious call, but something about this felt wrong. Not dangerous exactly. Just off, like a tug in the air pulling at her attention. She hesitated, thumb hovering above the screen. "Don't," she whispered to herself. Then, almost against her own judgment, she accepted the call. "Hello." Her voice came out calmer than she felt. For a heartbeat, there was nothing, no background noise, no static, just the kind of silence that makes a person hold their breath without realizing. Then a voice, low, tight, strained in a way she had never heard before, broke through. "Claire, are you alone?" Her fingers tightened around the phone. She knew that voice. Everyone at St. Matthew's Medical Center did. "Michael," she whispered. Michael Hale, CEO of the entire hospital, usually composed, clipped, guarded, sounded nothing like himself. His voice always carried the weight of authority, even in casual conversation. But tonight, it carried something else entirely. "Something fragile. Are you alone?" he asked again, quieter this time. Claire stood slowly, her chair legs scraping softly against the tile. Her heartbeat felt too loud in the small kitchen. She turned toward the hallway, confirming the obvious yes, she was alone. No teenage boy upstairs scrolling his phone. No one asleep on the living room couch. Just her. And a man who should never have been calling her at midnight. "Yes," she said finally. "What's going on?" A long breath came through the line. Not steady, more like he was gathering courage. "Tomorrow morning," he said, "they're going to blame you for something you didn't do." Everything inside her went very still. She gripped the edge of the table, forcing her voice to stay level. "Blame me for what?" Another breath. Another pause heavy enough to bend the room around it. "For the data leak," he said. "They're preparing a statement. They're naming you." Claire's knees almost gave out, but she stayed standing. Her mind flooded with questions, each colliding with the next. The leak, her why, how? She had barely touched that system beyond routine tasks. And why would the CEO call her himself? Michael continued, his words measured but frayed. "I didn't want you to hear it from them. And I didn't want you to walk into that building tomorrow without knowing the truth." Claire swallowed the dryness in her throat, suddenly sharp. "Michael," she murmured, "tell me exactly what's happening." But instead of answering, he fell silent. Not the avoiding kind of silence. A breaking kind. When he finally spoke, his voice sounded smaller. I'm outside, Claire." Her breath caught. "Outside," she repeated. "Outside where?" A soft exhale. "Your house." For a moment she couldn't move, couldn't think. She just stared at the dark window above the sink, half expecting a figure to appear behind the glass. Her pulse hammered at her ribs. "Why?" she whispered. "Why are you here?" The answer came gently, painfully honest. "Because I should have stopped this days ago. And because I need you to believe me when I tell you, you're being set up." He let the words hang between them. The refrigerator hummed in the background, the only sound anchoring her to the room. Claire set the phone down but didn't hang up. Her legs carried her toward the front hallway as if guided by instinct more than reason. She reached the door, placed her hand on the cool brass knob, and hesitated. The world outside felt suddenly too close, like a breath against her skin. "Michael," she said quietly, "if you're really out there." He didn't respond with words. But she heard it, the faint crunch of someone shifting their weight on her front steps. Something inside her, fear, curiosity, maybe both, pulled tight. She drew in a shaky breath, unlocked the deadbolt, and pulled the door open just a few inches. Enough to see the porch light flicker, enough to see a tall silhouette she never expected to find there. He looked nothing like the untouchable executive she'd known for years. Not at midnight. Not here. For a second, neither of them spoke. And then he lifted his head, meeting her eyes with an expression that made her stomach twist, an expression that said this night was only the beginning. The cold air drifted in, brushing against her face. She felt her world tilt. And she hadn't even heard the worst of it yet. The morning had begun like most others at Street. Matthews, with the familiar scent of antiseptic drifting through the hallways, and the faint bitterness of burnt coffee wafting from the break room. Fluorescent lights buzzed quietly overhead, casting everything in a pale, too-awake glow. Nurses moved with practiced urgency, carts rattled against the linoleum, and the PA system announced its steady stream of patient requests. But something felt different the moment Claire walked in, an undercurrent she couldn't quite name. Conversations dimmed when she passed. Two nurses exchanging charts fell silent, then resumed talking, in tight whispers, the moment her back turned. By the time she reached the administrative wing, the reason had surfaced on every break room TV. Local news headline: patient data leak at Street. Matthews under review, sources say internal error. A hush had settled over the staff, fear mixed with indignation. Claire smoothed her modest navy blazer, adjusting the frayed cuff where the fabric had gone thin. She'd meant to replace it months ago, but life had a way of redirecting her budget. Her worn flats clicked softly as she carried a stack of meeting packets toward conference room B, the room no one like her belonged in unless they were delivering something. Inside, senior leaders gathered around the long walnut table, steaming cups of coffee crowding the polished surface. The atmosphere buzzed with tension, an invisible static Claire felt immediately. She moved along the perimeter of the room, placing packets in front of each seat, quiet, efficient, unnoticed. The way they liked her. A board member with a sharp bob and sharper tone tapped her nails on the table. "This leak is a liability nightmare," she said. "We can't afford to stumble right now." Another man added, "Public trust is already thin. If we don't shape the story immediately, someone else will." Someone else. That phrase lingered. Claire kept her eyes down, careful not to meet anyone's gaze. A third voice, smooth, confident, dismissive, cut in. "The source appears to be an admin-level login. That narrows the pool significantly." A few eyes drifted toward her for the briefest second. A flicker, barely noticeable. But she noticed. Heat crawled up her neck, the kind that comes from being accused without words. She swallowed and set the last packet down, stepping back toward the wall. A piece of furniture, a shadow, a body that served a function. Michael Hale entered then. He wore a charcoal suit, no-tie shirt sleeves, crisp beneath the jacket. His expression was the same as always, unreadable, composed, the kind of calm that didn't comfort but warned. As he took his seat at the head of the table, conversations quieted. He didn't look at her, didn't nod, didn't even register she existed. Claire told herself it didn't matter. CEOs didn't look at administrative analysts. CEOs didn't look at women who blended into cubicles and coffee lines. Still, something tightened in her chest. He opened the meeting with his usual even tone. We will address the situation carefully. Facts first, optics second. We need a clean narrative before the public does. A clean narrative. The words were like a cold coin dropped into her stomach. They spent the next half hour dissecting the incident, how the file had been accessed when the breach occurred, what departments would face scrutiny. Not once did anyone mention the systemic flaws Claire had flagged months ago, the outdated software. Instead, every sentence seemed to circle back to one idea. Someone internally had failed. Someone had to take the fall. Michael's gaze swept the room, taking in each executive. Calm, detached. When it passed over her, it didn't slow. He didn't defend her. He didn't correct the assumptions. He didn't acknowledge the silent accusation forming in the room, and somehow that silence stung more than any spoken blame. When the meeting adjourned, people filed out in clusters, spiraling into low-voiced discussions and strategic muttering. Claire gathered the leftover packets with steady hands, keeping her breathing even. That's when Kevin from IT security approached her. He always wore crisp shirts and an air of performative politeness. Today was no different. "Hey Claire," he said with a genial smile that didn't touch his eyes. "Rough morning, huh?" She nodded once. "Seems like it." He handed her a small slip of paper. "We'll need your login credentials for verification. Standard procedure. Just to rule things out." Rule things out. The phrase landed wrong. Like they'd already made up their minds. Claire forced a polite smile. "I'll send them to the IT inbox." "Perfect," he said, giving her arm a brief pat, too familiar, too knowing. "We'll take good care of you." But the shine in his eyes wasn't reassuring. It was cold. When he left, Claire stood alone in the now empty room, listening to the faint hum of the overhead lights. Something in her gut tightened, not fear exactly, but the sensation of being slowly funneled toward a door she didn't choose. Back in her tiny office, a converted storage room with one narrow window, she set her things down, took a breath, and turned to her computer. There, already waiting in her inbox, was an automated flag from the compliance system. User C. Bennett accessed file patient data export, restricted timestamp 2:14 a.m. Her skin went cold. She hadn't logged in at 2 a.m. She hadn't opened that file. She hadn't touched anything related to that export. Her pulse thudded in her ears as she stared at the screen. This wasn't just suspicion anymore. Someone had already laid the groundwork. Someone wanted her name tied to the leak, and whoever they were, they'd moved faster than she ever imagined. A soft knock sounded at her door, 3 quiet taps. Claire froze, because suddenly she wasn't sure whether opening that door would bring clarity or the beginning of the end. Snow had turned to a messy, half-frozen slush by the time Claire eased her car out of the hospital parking lot. The wipers dragged across the windshield with a thin, complaining squeak, barely keeping the blurred streetlights in view. She drove with both hands tight on the steering wheel, shoulders hunched, the kind of posture that came from trying not to think too much. The local radio station was covering the same story that had haunted the halls all day. Street. Matthews Medical Center confirms a patient data breach under internal investigation. Sources suggest the error originated from admin-level access. Claire's hand shot forward and turned the volume down until it was a faint murmur, then silence. The slushy roads carried her past darkened houses, strings of winter lights drooping along porches, yards still flecked with the remnants of last week's snowstorm. Her small home, pale blue with a sagging gutter, waited at the end of a quiet street lined with maple trees stripped bare by winter. Inside, warmth greeted her slowly, like the house took a moment to recognize her. She hung her coat on the hook by the door, the fabric still damp from the snow. Her old calico cat Willow limped toward her with a soft, raspy meow, the voice of a creature who had seen better days and forgiven all of them. "Hey, sweetheart," Claire murmured, bending down to scratch under Willow's chin. "I'm home. I'm here." She filled the small ceramic bowl near the fridge, hearing the gentle tap-tap of Willow's nails as the cat followed. The house was quiet, too quiet, but it had been that way for years. Her son Ethan was 15, now dividing time between two homes, in a schedule marked by court agreements and careful coordination. This week was his father's turn. Claire heated the leftover casserole. The microwave hummed in the background while she leaned against the counter, her mind replaying the image of the flagged email in her inbox. She could still feel the cold rush that climbed her spine when she saw her username attached to something she never touched. Her phone buzzed on the counter. First, a text from her ex-husband Mark. Ethan's game moved to Saturday at 3. I'll drop him off Sunday evening. Then, less than a minute later, from her sister Anna, saw the news. You okay, Claire? Typed back quickly. I'm fine, really, just a long day. She hit send before she could change her mind. The casserole finished heating, but the smell barely registered. She ate standing up, taking small bites she barely tasted. Silence pressed around her in a familiar way, soft but suffocating. Later, she sat on the living room couch with her laptop open on her knees. She checked her bank app, the numbers staring back at her like quiet accusations. The mortgage payment clearing next week. The line of credit she dipped into when Ethan broke his arm 2 summers ago. The medical bill from her own procedure last spring, the one insurance barely touched. She closed the app, rubbing her forehead. Her eyes drifted to the photo taped to the side of the fridge. Ethan, grinning on a fishing trip 3 years earlier, his hair sun-bleached, his cheeks pink from the wind. She kept that picture there because on days like this, she needed the reminder that she wasn't fighting for promotions or recognition. She was fighting to keep the ground steady beneath his feet. When she finally went to the bathroom to get ready for bed, she paused at the mirror longer than usual. The bright lights revealed the faint lines around her eyes, the ones she only noticed at home, never under the hospital's fluorescent glare. Her reflection looked older tonight, not in years but in weight. She touched the edge of the mirror as if bracing herself against a truth she wished she didn't feel. No one at work would fight for her. Not the board, not IT. Not even Michael. The house creaked lightly as the wind picked up outside. She slipped into bed around 1130, the alarm already set for another early shift. Willow curled near her feet, a warm, vibrating lump of comfort. Claire closed her eyes and tried to slow her breathing. Nearly drifted off. Until her phone buzzed on the nightstand. Unknown. Number 1:158 p.m. She frowned at it through sleepy eyes. Her first thought, spam. Her third, darker, mimicked what the nurses whispered earlier: midnight calls are never good news. She let it ring out, but her heart kept a restless rhythm, beating strangely, as if something in her chest knew the story wasn't finished. 9 quiet minutes passed. Then the phone lit again. Unknown, number 1207 a.m. She exhaled long and tired, staring at the glowing rectangle. She didn't want to answer. Didn't want another thing pressing against the fragile edges of her life. But something in her gut, something she couldn't quite explain, told her this wasn't a call she could ignore. She reached out, hesitated, then pressed answer. Hello, she whispered. A breath, a voice, low, strained, shaken. Claire, it's Michael. Her pulse stuttered. I need to ask you something, he said quietly. Are you alone? The bedroom seemed to shrink around her. She swallowed hard, gripping the phone tighter. Yes, she whispered. Why? What's happening? A silence stretched between them, heavy and trembling. And then, tomorrow morning, he said, they're going to blame you for something you didn't do. The words hung there, cold and certain, and Claire felt the floor beneath her life crack quietly but completely. For a long moment, Claire didn't breathe. Michael's voice stayed in her ear, low and rough, carrying an urgency she had never heard from him in the pristine hallways of Street Matthews. Claire, he said again, are you alone? Her eyes flicked toward the hallway, toward the quiet rooms of her small house. Ethan's empty bedroom, the soft glow of the nightlight near the bathroom. Willow lifted her head from the foot of the bed, as if she sensed the shift in the air. Yes, Claire whispered. I told you I'm alone. What are you not telling me? A pause. A breath. Then he said something that made her sit up straighter, heart pounding in her chest. I'm outside. For a split second she thought he meant it figuratively, outside of protocol, outside of corporate boundaries, outside of the safe lines. Leaders are supposed to stay within, until she heard it. A soft knock. 3 gentle taps on her front door. Claire froze. The kind of freeze that starts in the bones and spreads outward. She pushed the covers back and stepped onto the cold floor, phone still pressed to her ear. "What do you mean you're outside?" she whispered, even as she moved down the hallway. "Claire," he said, his voice tired, "please don't panic. I didn't want to say all of this over the phone. Michael, why are you here?" Another knock, same rhythm, soft but insistent. She hesitated before reaching the narrow front window. The chill of the glass seeped through her fingertips as she gently pulled back the curtain. And there he was, Michael Hale, CEO of one of the largest hospitals in the state, standing on her small peeling porch at 1:4 a.m. His overcoat was dusted with snow. His breath curled visibly into the cold air with every exhale. His hair, normally immaculate, looked a little windswept, and in his hands he held a plain white bakery box. Claire blinked. He didn't move, didn't wave, didn't pretend this was normal. He simply looked up as though he knew she was behind the curtain. Her pulse hammered. "Michael," she whispered into the phone, "you can't be here." "What if someone sees you?" "I didn't come to cause trouble," he said softly. "I came because you deserve to hear the truth in person. Just 5 minutes. Then I'll go." She exhaled shaky. "What is in the box?" There was the faintest sound of embarrassment in his voice. "Pie," he said. "Apple. From that diner on West 30th. Claire's eyes widened despite everything. "You used to bring slices into team meetings," he continued quietly. "Before budget cuts, before everything changed. I remember you said their crust tasted like home." The words hit her unexpectedly, not because of the pie, but because she couldn't remember a single meeting where she'd thought he noticed anything about her. "Please," he said. "I don't expect you to trust me. I know how this looks. But I need you to let me explain what's happening before morning." Her mind raced at 1,000 miles an hour. What if her neighbors looked out the window? What if someone took a picture? What if this was all a setup? What if she opened the door and everything fell apart? But beneath all that fear, another question whispered, why would a man like him risk his reputation to be here? Claire opened the door barely, keeping the chain locked. Cold air rushed in around the narrow gap. Michael stepped back slightly, giving her space. His eyes looked tired, older, and for the first time, human. He lifted the white box awkwardly. "I didn't know what to bring," he admitted. This seemed less threatening than showing up empty-handed. Her breath fogged the air between them. 5 minutes, she said tightly. "And you stay right there." "I will," he promised. No lines crossed. But Claire wasn't sure she believed him, not because he seemed dangerous, but because the moment already felt like a line had been crossed long before she opened the door. She studied him, his rumpled coat, his trembling breath, the way his shoulders slumped, as though carrying something far heavier than a bakery box. "Why didn't you tell me at work?" she asked. "You let them talk like I wasn't even in the room." A flicker of regret passed across his face. "That's part of why I'm here." She swallowed. Her fingers tugged gently at the chain, the metal clicking softly as it strained against the hook. Her heartbeat echoed in her ears. This was the moment, the kind that doesn't look dramatic from the outside but becomes a hinge in a person's life, something that swings the story in a direction she can't undo. If she closed the door, maybe she could pretend the next morning would sort itself out. But she already knew it wouldn't. If she opened it, if she let him in, everything would change. Michael's voice dropped to something almost fragile. "Claire, please." The word wasn't commanding. It wasn't corporate. It wasn't strategic. It was simply a man asking for a chance to finally say something he should have said long ago. Her fingers trembled as she reached for the chain. For a moment she held it there, suspended, caught between self-preservation and the instinct that truth rarely comes at a reasonable hour. Then, with one quiet motion, she slid the chain free. And Michael Hale stepped out of the cold and into her life in a way neither of them could undo. The kitchen light hummed softly above them, casting a warm circle across the small wooden table Claire bought second-hand years ago. It was a humble room, yellow tile floor, mismatched mugs drying by the sink, a fading calendar with Ethan's school dates scribbled in blue ink. A room where she paid bills, packed lunches, lived quietly. not a room for a midnight meeting with her boss. Michael sat across from her, coat still on shoulders tense, as though he hadn't yet convinced himself he belonged in that chair. The plain white bakery box rested between them like a fragile peace offering. Claire crossed her arms. "Start talking." He sighed, rubbed both hands over his face, and when he finally looked up, the polished CEO veneer was gone. What remained was a man who looked cornered. "I didn't come here just to scare you," he said softly. "I came because you deserve to know the truth before it's too late." Her stomach tightened. What truth? He reached inside his coat and pulled out a folder, thin, creased at the edges, as if he'd looked at it 100 times before bringing it here. He slid it across the table. "The data leak. It didn't start with you." Claire didn't touch the folder. Her fingers curled against the table edge. "I never said it did." "I know," he replied quietly. "But the board is going to." A cold chill crawled up her spine. Michael continued, voice steady but low, as though he feared the walls might overhear. "The access trail shows a login from your account at 2:14 a.m. The export, the reroute, the timestamp, it all points back to you." Her jaw clenched. "Except I wasn't logged in." "I know," he said, leaning forward. "I know that now." Claire stared at him, searching for sincerity, for guilt, for anything that proved he hadn't walked into her home to finish what the board started. "Then, who accessed it?" His mouth tightened. "Kevin." Her breath caught. "It Kevin?" He nodded. "He rerouted the file through your admin pathway. He used elevated privileges to disguise his steps. It was deliberate." The room felt suddenly smaller. "Why?" she whispered. "To give the board a clean outcome." Michael's voice darkened. "A fall person with no political ties, no financial influence, no one on the board who'd fight for her." Her throat tightened painfully. "You mean someone like me?" He didn't answer. He didn't have to. Claire stared at the folder at his hands, large, steady, resting on the table like twin weights of guilt. "How long have you known?" she asked. He blinked, and for the first time she saw its shame. "I suspected a few days ago," he said quietly. "There were patterns in the logs that didn't fit you. But I only got confirmation tonight." "Tonight?" she echoed, her voice sharpening. "Tonight, Michael. After an entire week of whispers behind my back. After an entire day where you let them sit in a room and circle me like vultures." He winced. "You didn't look at me," she said. "Not once." "I couldn't," he murmured. "Why?" she shot back. "Because you already knew they wanted me gone." He opened his mouth, but she kept going. "You sat at the head of that table. You heard them hint it was my login. You let them accuse me with their eyes. And you said nothing." The hurt in her voice chilled even her own ears. Michael exhaled slowly, like someone bracing for impact. "You're right," he whispered. "I failed you today." The admission landed like a stone in her chest, not comforting but devastating. He pushed the folder closer. "But that's not why I came tonight." "Then why are you here?" He hesitated, and something fragile flickered across his face. Fear, maybe, or resolve. "Because tomorrow morning," he said, "I'm taking the blame." Claire stared. "What I'm going to tell the board, I authorized the changes that led to the leak. That I missed the protocol checks. That the oversight was mine." Her breath escaped her like she'd been punched. "They'll strip me of my position," he continued. "Maybe my license. The press will tear me apart, but if someone has to fall, it won't be you." The words hung in the still kitchen air. She should have felt relief, gratitude, something warm. But all she felt was fury. "You're telling me," she said slowly, voice trembling, "that you're going to sacrifice your entire career for something you didn't do?" "Yes." "Because you didn't bother to stand up for me when it mattered," he swallowed. "Claire, no." She pushed back from the table, the chair legs scraping loudly against the floor. "You waited until I was already drowning to throw me a life jacket. And now you want credit for it." His expression fractured. "I'm not asking for credit," he said. "I'm asking for forgiveness." She shook her head, disbelief washing over her in waves. "You knew," she whispered. "You knew something was wrong. But you didn't protect me. You didn't speak up. You didn't even look at me." Her voice cracked, and she hated that it did. Michael stood slowly, palms open as though approaching a frightened animal. I was trying to protect the hospital, he said, pain threading through his words. But tonight I realized that doesn't mean anything if I can't protect the people who keep it standing. The kitchen fell silent, except for the steady tick of the wall clock. Claire wrapped her arms around herself, shaking not from fear, but from the terrible mix of betrayal and reluctant understanding pulling her apart inside. He had come here to sacrifice himself. But he had also come too late. She didn't know whether to scream or to sit back down. And as she stared at him across the small worn kitchen, she felt the first hint of something she didn't want to name: respect. Thin as a thread, but they're all the same. For a long moment, the kitchen hummed with a brittle silence, two people on opposite shores of the same storm. The yellow light overhead flickered once, as if even the house sensed something was shifting between them. Michael stood near the table, the folder still open in front of him, pages like open wounds revealing what had been done in her name. Claire remained by the counter, hands braced against its edge, her breath uneven but her eyes sharp. "You don't understand," he said, quietly, lifting a hand as though trying to steady the moment. "This is the only way to keep your record clean. If someone has to take the fall, it should be the person with the widest shoulders." She let out a humorless laugh. "Widest shoulders? You didn't lift a finger in that meeting today." He flinched, and a shadow crossed his face. "I know, Claire. I know I failed you there. Failed me." Her voice rose, not loud but sharp. "You didn't fail me, Michael. You abandoned me. You sat at the end of that long polished table and let them treat me like a footnote, like I wasn't even worth defending." "I was trying to buy time," he whispered. "You mean you were trying to protect yourself?" she countered, and the room went still. He didn't argue, he didn't deny it, and that honesty, raw, unpolished, hurt more than any rehearsed apology would have. He took a step toward her, then paused, sensing the boundary she wasn't ready to cross. "I'm trying to make this right," he said, voice low. "If I fall, I'll land on my feet. People like me always do." Her jaw clenched. "And people like me don't." His eyes softened. "That's why I'm doing this." "No," she said firmly, the words slicing the air between them. "You're not doing this for me. You're doing it because it's the last option you have left. You want to leave with your conscience clean." He inhaled sharply, as though she'd knocked the wind out of him. "Claire, don't." Her voice broke, but only for a moment. "You think the worst they can do to me is fire me, ruin my resume, smear my name." Her hands tightened on the counter. "I've spent my entire adult life trying to survive in places that don't see me. Places where the loud ones rise and the quiet ones drown. I've watched nurses, good nurses, get pushed out because they didn't fit some donor-approved image. I've watched staff get ignored unless they made noise. And I learned to stay silent just to keep my job, my insurance, my dignity." Her breath wavered, but her spine stayed straight. "For years," she continued softly, "I thought disappearing was the safest way to live." Michael's expression shifted, pain recognition, maybe even guilt woven into the lines of his face. She stepped away from the counter and faced him directly now. "But I'm done disappearing." He swallowed, voice barely above a whisper. "I never wanted you to disappear, but you let them pretend I didn't exist," she said, "and that's the same thing." A long moment passed. The refrigerator hummed. Snow tapped faintly at the window. Claire's heartbeat slowed, steadied, gained weight. Michael finally exhaled. "Claire, if I stand up tomorrow, if I take responsibility, you walk away untouched. They won't dare look in your direction." "It's not about walking away untouched," she said. "It's about walking away knowing I stood for myself." He held her gaze, then really held it, as though searching for something in her he wasn't sure he had the right to see. "You don't have to do anything," he said. "Let me do this." "No." He blinked. "No." She stepped closer, closing the distance between them until only the white bakery box rested between their hands. "I won't let you be the only one in that room telling the truth," she said quietly. "If someone is going to speak my name, I want it to be me. I want it to be my voice." He opened his mouth, but she was already moving, picking up the pages he'd brought, studying the timestamps, the altered pathways, the buried lines that proved she'd been framed. Her shoulders straightened with every line she read. Finally she looked up. "If you're going to stand up tomorrow," she said, her voice steady as steel, "I'll be standing next to you." His breath hitched. She wasn't shouting. She wasn't trembling. She wasn't begging. She simply knew. I won't let anyone tell my story for me again, she finished. The sentence settled between them like a vow. Michael stared at her, something unguarded flickering in his eyes, respect, admiration, and something deeper he didn't dare name. Claire, he whispered, voice softening in a way she'd never heard. But she turned away, pulling a coat from the back of her dining chair, gathering her nerves as the night pressed close outside. Tomorrow would be a storm, and for the first time in her life, she wasn't planning to hide from it. The hospital auditorium had never felt so full. Rows of folding chairs stretched toward a small temporary stage at the front. The overhead lights buzzed with a harsh morning brightness, too sharp for how early it was. Staff piled in with styrofoam cups of watery coffee, clutching clipboards and muttering to one another in tight, uneasy clusters. The entire place smelled like disinfectant and dread. Claire stood near the back wall, her coat still on the folder, pressed to her chest like armor. Her heart thudded painfully, each beat loud enough she wondered if the people beside her could hear it. She had barely slept every minute of the night, replaying the same silent question, what if no one believes me? On the stage, Kevin stepped up to the podium. Of course he did. He wore a crisp shirt, the sleeves rolled just enough to look professional but relatable. His smile was well-practiced, gentle, sympathetic, the face of someone who would gladly pat you on the shoulder while slipping the knife in deeper. Good morning, everyone, he began, voice smooth as polished stone. We're here today to address the unfortunate breach that shook our community. Claire felt her stomach knot. He continued, gesturing to a few printed charts behind him. Our priority is protecting patients. Sometimes difficult moments require clear accountability. We have traced the error to... The auditorium held its breath. Claire felt her hands shake. Not from fear anymore, but from something fiercer breaking through. Not this time. Before her mind had fully caught up, her body stood. Her chair scraped against the floor. Heads turned. But she didn't stop. Her shoes clicked down the center aisle, slow, steady, echoing louder than she meant them to. She walked as though pulled forward by something undeniable, something necessary. Kevin paused mid-sentence, surprise flashing across his face. Claire, someone whispered from the front row. You okay? Another murmured. She ignored them. Every step made her spine straighter. When she reached the front, she lifted her chin. Excuse me, she said, voice calm but strong. I'd like the microphone. Kevin blinked, recovering fast. Claire, this isn't. As the person whose name appears in your report, she said evenly, I believe I have a right to speak. A wave of murmurs rolled through the room. Kevin hesitated. Just for a moment. He hadn't been expecting a challenge. Not from her, the quiet woman who kept copier paper stocked and carried meeting packets without complaint. Claire didn't move. Her eyes locked onto his. He finally extended the microphone, jaw tight. She took it in a steady hand, grateful that her trembling had finally stopped. She turned to face the room, hundreds of staff members, nurses, clerks, physicians, janitors, people she passed every day, people who barely knew her name. My name is Claire Bennett, she began. Soft gasps. Some nods. A few frowns like they were trying to place her, and I want to say clearly I did not leak anything. Her voice rang out much louder than she expected, clear, true, anchored by something older than fear. The room whispered like a field of tall grass in the wind. Claire lifted the folder in her hands. These are access logs showing unusual activity from my credentials at 2:14 a.m. A time I wasn't even in the building. These logs also show rerouting paths that someone with higher privileges manipulated. Kevin took a step toward her. Claire, this is not, she raised a hand. I'm speaking. He stopped. The room stilled. I've worked at Street Matthews for 9 years, she continued. I've shown up early. I've stayed late. I've carried the weight of departments larger than myself, because this place matters. Because patients matter. Her voice warmed with something that had been buried far too long, and I refuse to let my name be used as a shield for the mistakes of people with more power than me. The words hit the auditorium like a quiet thunderclap. Some staff straightened in their seats, others exchanged looks. A few nurses visibly nodded, the kind of nod that said, finally. Kevin opened his mouth again, but something shifted in the room before he could speak. A sound behind them. The auditorium doors opened. Every head turned. Michael Hale walked in, not in his tailored CEO suit, not with the composed authority he wore like a second skin. He came in wearing a simple charcoal jacket, shirt open at the collar, looking like a man who had spent the night wrestling with truth and consequence. Most striking of all, he wasn't walking like a leader entering his domain. He was walking like someone ready to be stripped of everything. Claire felt her breath catch. He didn't rush, he didn't hide. He simply moved down the aisle with quiet certainty, eyes fixed on her, not possessive, not pleading, but resolute. And the room reacted. Gasps. Whispers, a ripple of electricity. Kevin stiffened behind her. Michael stepped onto the stage beside Claire, hands at his sides, gaze sweeping the crowd before he finally spoke. Before any further accusations are made, he said softly, you should all hear the truth. Claire felt the air shift, the moment tilting, deepening, opening into something none of them could turn back from. For a heartbeat, the auditorium felt utterly still. Michael stood beside Claire, shoulders squared, hands calm at his sides. He didn't look like a man cornered or defeated. He looked like someone who had finally stopped running. His voice carried across the rows of hospital staff with a steadiness that made people lean forward. There is evidence, he said, that the data trail connected to Miss Bennett was tampered with. Any conclusions drawn before the investigation is complete are premature. A ripple of shock moved through the room. People exchanged glances, surprised, curious, suddenly aware that the narrative they'd been fed wasn't as neat as Kevin had suggested. Kevin stepped forward, his smile tightening. Michael, with all respect, Michael didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. Leadership, he continued, means going first. So he said, effective immediately, I am stepping down as CEO while the investigation proceeds. I will not lead this hospital while there is even a shadow of doubt. Not over my judgment, and certainly not over my integrity. Gasps. A few muffled exclamations. Someone in the back dropped a coffee cup. Claire felt her breath catch her chest, tightening not with fear, but with something heavier. Gratitude. Guilt. Respect. Loss. She couldn't name it, but it pressed against her ribs. Kevin's composure cracked visibly. This isn't the appropriate venue, he snapped. We should discuss these matters privately. But his voice no longer commanded the room. Staff who moments before sat stiff and unsure, now stared at him with suspicion, seeing the seams, the rehearsed politeness, the cracks Claire had felt in her bones. Michael stepped back, nodding once toward Claire. Not theatrically, not for applause, simply as acknowledgement, and then without further explanation, he left the stage. The meeting dissolved into whispers. Questions. A few stunned silences. It didn't take long for HR to find Claire. 2 representatives. Clipboard. Soft voices that tried to sound sympathetic. Claire, we need to ask you to pack your personal items. She stared at them. I thought the investigation wasn't over. It isn't one of them, said, avoiding her eyes. But until we complete our review, you'll be placed on administrative leave. Effective immediately. The phrase had a coldness no gentle tone could soften. She nodded once. I understand. They walked beside her through hallways. She had memorized over 9 years the nurse charts, the hand sanitizing stations, the faded bulletin boards with holiday potlucks and CPR certifications posted at crooked angles. People watched her as she passed. Some pretended not to. Others glanced quickly away. But a few, just a few, met her eyes. Janine from scheduling squeezed her hand, whispering, "Hang in there." A respiratory therapist she barely knew mouthed, "We're with you." Even Dr. Harris, who rarely noticed anyone without a white coat, stepped aside and murmured, "For what it's worth, I believe you." Small things, tiny kindnesses, but each one caught in her chest like a breath she didn't know she needed. In her office, she gathered what little she had, a framed photo of Ethan at age 10, the mug with chipped paint that read, "World's Okayest Morning Person," a stack of sticky notes she kept meaning to transfer into a notebook. As she placed them in a paper bag, she wondered if this was how her story here would end, quietly, with a whisper instead of a fight. The HR reps hovered awkwardly in the doorway, as though unsure whether they should apologize or hurry her along. Claire didn't rush. She moved gently, deliberately, every motion a refusal to be erased. When she finally stepped into the hallway with her paper bag, the building felt heavier, broader, like it was watching her leave. "Thank you," she said softly to the HR reps. Her voice did not shake. She walked toward the main lobby, shoes clicking softly on the polished floor. Each step carried the weight of 9 years, every early shift, every late night, every fight she'd swallowed for the sake of stability. The automatic doors ahead slid open with a quiet hiss. And that's when she saw him. Through the glass in the winter-bright lobby, Michael Hale stood at the security desk. His jacket was folded over one arm. His ID badge, sleek silver, embossed with Chief Executive Officer, rested in his hand. Slowly, deliberately, he placed it on the counter. The security guard nodded solemnly. Michael stepped back, and for one fleeting second before he turned to leave, he lifted his gaze. His eyes found Claire through the glass like a thread drawn taut between them. No words passed, no gesture, just recognition, understanding. Two people falling from different heights and landing on the same ground. Claire felt the moment carve itself into her memory, painful, sharp, yet strangely freeing. Michael nodded once, barely perceptible. Claire's breath trembled, but she stood straighter, and then he walked out into the cold, the doors closing behind him. She watched the space where he'd stood, the ghost of him lingering in the stillness. For the first time since the nightmare began, Claire understood something deeply, almost painfully. Sometimes the only way to stay whole is to let the world fall apart around you, and hers had just begun. The first 2 days at home stretched out like a strange fog, thick, slow, and unsettlingly quiet. No calls from Street Matthews, no emails, no official updates, just silence. The kind of silence that made a person feel erased. Claire tried to keep busy. She folded laundry she'd ignored for weeks. She scrubbed the stove. She rearranged the pantry. She took Willow to the vet for her arthritis shot, even though she didn't know when her next paycheck would come. But no matter what she did, the background noise of the world seemed to press against her in the worst possible way. The local news kept running segments about the data breach, polite, carefully worded speculation about internal failures and administrative oversight. They never said her name, but they didn't have to. Her picture had already been shown earlier in the week, taken from the hospital website, her staff ID photo, the one she always hated because the lighting washed her out. The world had seen that face, even if they didn't know the whole story. Late that afternoon, her phone buzzed with a familiar ringtone. "Ethan." She answered immediately. "Hey, sweetheart. Mom, are you okay?" His voice was young but heavy, like he was trying to sound older than his 15 years. Dad had the news on, and her heart broke a little. "I'm okay," she said gently. "Really? They said someone messed up at your hospital. They showed your picture." Dad said it's complicated. "It is complicated," she admitted. "But I'm not in trouble." "You sure?" The question landed softly, but it carved right through her. "I'm sure." She forced warmth into her voice. "Focus on school. I'll see you Sunday, okay? He paused. "Love you, Mom. I love you too." When the call ended, Claire sat on the couch for a long moment, staring at the muted TV while her own reflection hovered in the black screen. "I have to fix this," she thought. "Not just for me, but for him." As dusk settled, she walked to the front door to check if the mail had come, just to give her hands something to do. The porch light clicked on automatically, casting a soft glow across the small stoop. That's when she saw it. A plain manila envelope lying quietly near the welcome mat. No postage, no return address, just her name written in black marker, Claire. Her pulse quickened. She picked it up carefully, glancing around the darkening neighborhood. No footsteps on the sidewalk, no running car, no shadow ducking away. Just winter wind and the rustle of bare branches. Inside the envelope were 2 items, a folded memo and a small silver USB drive. She unfolded the memo first. It was an internal communication, top-level distribution only. Her stomach dropped as she scanned the typed lines. "We need a single public scapegoat to mitigate donor concern and stabilize public perception. K.R. Kevin Ross." Not even pretending to hide his intention. Claire's breath grew shallow. Then she unfolded the second sheet, much smaller, handwritten in block letters. He stood up for you. Now they're going to bury him. If you want to save him and yourself, you can't stay quiet. No signature. No hint of who sent it, but her hands trembled as she held the message. Someone inside the system knew what was happening. Someone cared enough to risk dropping evidence at her doorstep. Someone wanted her to fight. She stared at the USB drive, a simple black rectangle with one word scratched on the label: proof. Her pulse kicked into high gear. She locked the front door, double-checking it out of instinct, then hurried to the kitchen. Her old laptop sat on the table, slow but trustworthy, untouched by hospital software. She sat down, inserted the USB, and waited as the folders loaded. The first file was a video. Security camera footage. Claire clicked it open, and the image flickered to life. A dimly lit workstation. An IT terminal. A man in a collared shirt typing rapidly. Kevin. At 2:14 a.m. Her heartbeat roared in her ears. He worked with the easy confidence of someone who had done this before, navigating menus, bypassing prompts, opening restricted directories. The screen showed a login window flash briefly. User C. Bennett, no, Claire whispered, hand covering her mouth. No, no, no. Kevin inserted a keycard. Lines of code executed. Her username appeared again, tied to a file she had never touched. She clicked the next file. Access logs, time-stamped, unaltered, and damning. A third file contained cross-referenced badge records, showing she hadn't even been in the building that night. Her breath shook, her jaw set. Her eyes burned with something hot and fierce. They were going to bury me, she realized. And now they're going to bury him. Michael. His quiet, resigned face in the auditorium flashed in her mind, his hands resting at his sides, the way his gaze met hers through the glass as he surrendered his badge. He had fallen harder than she had, and he had fallen protecting her. No one had ever done something like that for her. Claire closed her eyes, steadying herself. This evidence wasn't just a lifeline. It was a matchstick, a spark, something powerful enough to burn the whole lie down. She looked at the screen again, replaying Kevin's midnight sabotage, and in the reflection of the monitor, she saw herself not as a victim, not as someone being erased, but as a woman who had finally been handed the truth. The kind of truth that demands action, the kind that changes everything. The summons arrived on a gray Tuesday morning, printed on heavy paper, and slipped under her front door like something out of an old courtroom drama. Request for appearance. Confidential Review Street, Matthews Medical Center Board of Directors. Claire held the envelope for several seconds before opening it, reading the words twice, maybe 3 times. They sounded polite, measured, icy, but beneath every line was an unmistakable threat. Show up and defend yourself, if you can. She set the paper down and inhaled slowly. She was tired of fear of silence, of waiting for other people to decide the direction of her life. So she ironed her best blouse, tied her hair, neatly tucked the USB drive into her bag, and drove to the hospital with both hands gripping the wheel. The security guard at the entrance didn't smile at her, but he didn't glare either. Indifference, she realized, could almost feel like mercy. A staff member escorted her through quiet hallways to the boardroom, one she had only ever seen from the outside. The door was heavy mahogany, the kind that signaled power before you even crossed the threshold. Inside, the air was cool, artificially still. A long, polished table stretched nearly wall to wall. Leather chairs, bottled water arranged with military precision, legal counsel seated near the end, board members in tailored suits scrolling through their tablets. And at the far right, Kevin, perfectly pressed shirt, perfectly composed, smile, perfectly confident in the machinery he thought he controlled. Claire's stomach tightened. Then she saw him. At the far end of the table, separated from everyone else as though placed on an island, Michael Hale. No title plate in front of him now. No power suit. Just a simple navy jacket and a man who looked like he'd spent days fighting the tide. He met her gaze briefly. A small nod. Not apologetic, not pleading. Just steady. Someone gestured for her to sit. She chose a seat not too close to Kevin, not too far from Michael. The chair felt cold beneath her. The board chair, a tall man with rimless glasses, folded his hands. "Miss Bennett," he began, "thank you for joining us. We're here to clarify your involvement in the recent breach." Claire kept her voice level. "Of course." A woman to the left leaned forward. "Let's begin with your access history. Records suggest your credentials were used to obtain restricted patient files." Claire nodded once. "They were, but not by me." Several board members shifted unimpressed. "Miss Bennett," the chair said carefully, "we will need more than your word." "I expected that," she replied, reaching calmly into her bag. She placed the USB drive on the table. "What's that?" Kevin asked too quickly. "Evidence," Claire said. "Given to me anonymously." The legal counsel frowned. "Miss Bennett, anonymous sources are unreliable." "Please," she said, her tone polite but firm. "Just look at it." The board exchanged glances. One of the IT advisors, a thin young man with round glasses, inserted the drive into a laptop connected to the screen. A folder labeled Proof appeared. He clicked, "First file security footage." Kevin's face flickered onto the display, caught in grainy grayscale, sitting at a terminal at 214 a.m. typing rapidly. The room reacted as though someone had sucked the air from it. The IT advisor spoke carefully. "This appears authentic. I see no signs of manipulation so far." Kevin straightened, but his smile wavered. "That footage could have been doctored. Night Shift often uses shared terminals. This doesn't prove." "Next file," Claire said. Access logs, loaded on screen, unaltered, timestamped, mapped. Her credentials, Kevin's badge location, system override codes. The lines formed a trail that even a layperson could follow. The IT advisor looked up, startled. "These logs are original, untouched. This is the raw server output." Silence rippled across the table. Kevin shifted, then forced a laugh. "Anyone could have faked that. Someone clearly wants to frame me. We shouldn't jump to conclusions." Michael's voice cut through the room, quiet but powerful. "No one is jumping, Kevin." Eyes turned toward him. For a moment he didn't move. Then, with deliberate calm, he reached into his jacket and placed a small digital recorder on the table. Claire's breath caught. The board chair frowned. "Mr. Hale, what is this?" "Something I should have shared sooner," Michael said. His voice carried none of the controlled corporate tone he once wielded so effortlessly. "A conversation from several weeks ago. One I recorded because it disturbed me." He pressed a button. Kevin's voice filled the room, unmistakable. "We just need a clean fall person, Mike. Admin staff are used to taking hits. They're practically built for it." A pause. Static. Then Kevin again. "No one will fight for her. It's simple. Efficient." The room turned to stone. Claire felt something cold and heavy shift inside her, validation, anger, grief, all tangled together. Kevin paled, mouth opening and closing like a man drowning on dry land. That was out of context," he stammered. "We were brainstorming scenarios." "No," Michael said quietly. "You were plotting." The board chair leaned back, expression unreadable but stern. The legal counsel spoke next, tone clipped. "Mr. Ross, given the evidence presented, we will need to suspend you pending a full forensic audit." Kevin stood abruptly. "This is ridiculous. You're going to take her side. She's an administrator." No one answered. Not a single person. Kevin's breath grew ragged. His hands curled into fists. For a moment, Claire thought he might lunge, but instead he turned sharply, storming out of the boardroom, the door slamming behind him with a violence that echoed down the corridor. Silence settled, thick and unmistakable. The board chair exhaled slowly. "Bennett, it seems we owe you an apology." But Claire shook her head, her voice steady. "This isn't just about me." Her gaze drifted to Michael, whose eyes held something like gratitude or maybe relief. The chair cleared his throat. "We will reconvene with next steps. Today's session is adjourned." Chairs shifted. Papers shuffled. People avoided each other's eyes. Claire stood, feeling the weight of the moment settle over her, heavy but clarifying, like a storm finally reaching ground. As she walked toward the exit, she could sense it. Nothing would ever be the same. But for the first time, that thought didn't terrify her. It lit something inside her. Something alive. The headlines faded faster than anyone expected. 2 weeks after the hearing, the hospital released a brief, polished statement about temporary leadership restructuring and a commitment to renewed integrity. Kevin's name appeared only once, buried near the bottom, suspended pending legal proceedings. Michael's name didn't appear at all. Claire read the statement on her phone while sitting at her kitchen table, her cereal going soggy as she scrolled. The world had moved on. Even the mess that had nearly cost her everything had become just another news item swallowed by the next scandal. A day later, a formal email arrived. "We would be pleased to welcome you back in your previous role." No apology, no acknowledgement, no clearing of her name. It was like everything she endured had been erased, swept under a rug, woven from bureaucracy and indifference. She stared at the screen for a long time before closing the laptop. Going back would mean pretending none of it happened. Pretending she wasn't targeted. Pretending she hadn't found her voice in that auditorium. Claire had spent years shrinking herself to fit into places that weren't built for her. She was done with that, so she walked away. 2 weeks later, she began her new job 3 miles west, past rows of modest townhouses and a rust-colored water tower at the Maple Ridge Community Clinic. A small, overstretched, good-hearted place that always seemed to smell faintly of cinnamon and antiseptic. The pay was lower, the hours longer, the walls thinner, but the people, God, the people were soft in all the right places. Nurses called patients by first name. Patients brought their own blankets. Someone's grandmother crocheted hats for newborns and left them in a laundry basket by the door with a sign that said, "Take one." Love included. On Claire's first week, a patient in her 70s pulled her aside and said, "Honey, I don't know who hired you, but bless them. You listen better than most folks half your age." Claire went home that night and cried quietly, but not from sadness. Something in her chest had begun to unclench. She started riding her bike to work when the weather allowed. She learned the names of the neighborhood kids who skateboarded past the clinic every afternoon. She taped her sons drawing a crooked cat wearing a stethoscope to the break room fridge. Life didn't feel big, but it felt honest. One Thursday evening, the clinic had finally gone quiet. Claire was alone in the small charting room, tapping in last-minute notes before heading home. A string of sleepy fluorescent lights hummed above her. She didn't hear the footsteps at first, just the soft knock on the open door frame. When she looked up, her breath caught. Not the CEO. Not the man cornered in a boardroom. Just Michael. In his hands, the same white bakery box from that night on her porch. Her eyebrows lifted. "Apple pie again," he smiled, tired, self-conscious, a little warm. "You once said it was the only pie that made staff meetings bearable." I took it as a hint. Claire leaned back in her chair. "Is this a peace offering or a bribe?" "Depends," he said, stepping inside. "Will it work either way?" She chuckled softly, motioning to the spare chair. He set the box on the table between them, the sugary smell drifting warm into the cramped room. "How've you been?" she asked. He exhaled, long, slow, honest. Untethered, but for the first time in years, not ashamed of it. She studied him. He looked lighter somehow. The weight of the CEO title no longer pressed into his shoulders. His eyes, usually sharp and calculating, had softened around the edges. "I've had offers," he said, fingers tracing the edge of the box. "Bigger hospitals, bigger titles." And Claire asked. "I turned them down." She blinked, surprised. Why? He hesitated, searching for words he wasn't used to saying aloud. "I spent so many years building ladders that led nowhere good. I don't want to climb another one." He looked at her fully, then sincere and steady. "I've been thinking, maybe it's time to build something different. Smaller, cleaner, human." Her chest tightened, not from fear this time, but from something gentler, almost warm. "That sounds..." She paused, choosing the right word. "Brave." He shook his head with a low laugh. "Maybe just foolish." "No," she said softly. "Not foolish." A quiet stretched between them, not awkward, not heavy, just full. Finally, he said, "Can I ask you something?" Claire nodded. "Do you think..." He swallowed. "Do you think I deserve another chance? Not at the hospital, just somewhere." She felt the question settle in the room like dust illuminated by warm light. It wasn't about a job or reputation. or even forgiveness. It was a man asking if he was allowed to begin again. Claire closed the pie box gently and folded her hands. "I think," she said slowly, "we both do." His expression shifted: relief, gratitude, something like cautious hope. He leaned back, letting out a breath he'd been holding for months. "When I saw you speak at that town hall," he said softly, "I thought, that's what integrity looks like. I'm trying to follow that example." She looked down, suddenly shy. "I was terrified." He shook his head. "You didn't look terrified. You looked like someone refusing to disappear." The words settled deep inside her, warm as the pie between them. She smiled, small but real. "So, what now?" Michael's voice dropped to a quiet, almost tentative register. "Maybe we figure that out over a slice, one slow step at a time." Claire opened the bakery box. The scent of cinnamon and baked apples filled the tiny room. She handed him a fork. And just as he took it, just as their fingers brushed the lights, flickered once, soft, brief, almost like a wink from the universe. Claire looked up, a question forming in her mind. And that was when the clinic's back door slammed somewhere down the hall. A sudden, sharp sound. Out of place, out of rhythm, a reminder that not every storm leaves clean skies behind. Claire and Michael exchanged glances. The pie remained untouched. A chill moved quietly through her. Something wasn't finished. Not yet. The coffee shop was the kind of place people wandered into without thinking. Uneven, wooden floors, a chalkboard menu smudged with fingerprints, and a bell above the door that chimed like an old wind chime caught in a gentle breeze. It sat only 3 blocks from the clinic, tucked between a laundromat and a thrift store that sold used flannel shirts for $5. Claire arrived early. She took a seat by the window, hands wrapped around a ceramic mug painted with faded sunflowers. Outside, the late afternoon light softened the edges of the street, turning passing cars into slow-moving silhouettes. She wasn't nervous exactly, but something inside her felt unsettled. Like a door she thought she'd closed had cracked open again. When the bell chimed, she didn't need to look up to know it was him. Michael slid into the seat across from her, offering a small, almost shy smile. Not the confident CEO she used to know, something gentler, now more grounded. "I didn't make you wait long, did I?" "No," she said. "I just got here." He ordered black coffee, then folded his hands on the table, studying her in the thoughtful, unhurried way he'd begun doing since leaving Street Matthews. He had lost the instinct to command a room. Now he seemed content to simply inhabit it. "I know why you asked to meet," Claire said softly. "You're not just checking in." He gave a quiet laugh. "No, I'm afraid not." He reached into his coat and pulled out a thin folder, not official, not heavy, just a few stapled pages with handwritten notes. "I've been working on something," he said. "A different kind of healthcare center, small, community-focused, transparent billing, fair staffing ratios, the kind of place that doesn't treat people like reimbursement codes or expendable labor." Claire's breath stilled. He continued, voice steady but full of a quiet fire she hadn't heard from him before. "I want to build an outpatient center on the east side. Underserved neighborhoods, high ER overflow rates, limited insurance literacy. We'd focus on preventative care, same-day appointments, genuine patient education." He slid the folder toward her. "And I want you to help build it." She didn't touch the folder. "Not yet." "As what?" "An assistant and admin." He shook his head firmly. "As director of patient services. You would shape how patients are treated, how staff are treated. You'd build the culture from the ground up." Claire blinked. Director. Her name on the door, a seat at the table instead of a chair in the corner. Power used without fear of punishment. But with power came risk, and her pulse ticked with memories, sterile boardrooms, whispered accusations, a system that swallowed people whole. "Why me, Michael?" she asked quietly. "Is this about guilt? About fixing what happened?" His answer came without hesitation. "No, this is about respect." He leaned closer, voice low but unwavering. "You're the one who stood up when everyone else sat down. You're the one who understood the patients, the staff, the cracks no one else wanted to admit were there. And I don't want to build anything again without someone like you at the table." Her throat tightened unexpectedly, and she had to look down at her mug to steady herself. "Michael." She began choosing her words with care. I just found solid ground again. I'm afraid of stepping into another structure that could collapse around me, even if it's one you're trying to build differently. He nodded, accepting the fear without trying to argue it away. I won't pretend this would be easy, he said. I won't promise we'll get everything right, but I can promise this won't be you cleaning up after other people's messes. It'll be you designing the system before the mess even begins. She finally opened the folder. Inside were simple sketches, hand-drawn layouts of exam rooms, patient waiting areas, bilingual pamphlet drafts, staffing charts that valued human limits instead of exploiting them. It wasn't corporate. It wasn't polished. It was honest. She looked up again. What about funding? I have enough to start, he said. Investors willing to step in once we secure a location. We'd begin with 3 physicians, 2 nurses, a small admin team, and what would my salary be? She asked, trying to sound casual. He grinned. Competitive. And non-negotiable in the wrong direction. She laughed softly, despite herself. A few minutes passed in quiet, comfortable, slow, the hum of the espresso machine filling the spaces their words didn't reach. Then Michael asked, "What are you thinking?" She closed the folder carefully and placed both hands flat on top of it. I think, she said slowly, that I don't want to be anyone's token or side note or footnote again. It won't be, he promised. She leaned back, studied him, really studied him, the man who once stood at the top of a tower, now sitting humbly in a coffee shop across from her, asking to build something not above her but with her. Michael, she said softly, if I do this, if I really do this. He held her gaze, waiting. My name goes on the door next to yours. No hesitation. No surprise. No ego. He nodded once, firmly. Of course it does. She let out a slow breath she hadn't realized she was holding. This wasn't a rescue. This wasn't a debt. This wasn't a man giving her a place. This was a man offering to share one. A new kind of offer. She reached for her coffee, her fingers brushing the folder again. I'm not saying yes, Claire said quietly. I know, he replied with a small smile. But you didn't say no. And somehow that felt like the beginning of something. Not certain. Not safe. But possible. Outside, the late afternoon sun had dipped lower, casting long shadows across the street, shadows that looked less like endings and more like invitations to step forward. Claire glanced toward the window, then back at Michael. Let me think, she said. Take all the time you need. But the light in his eyes said he already knew she was closer to yes than she realized. The email from the journalist arrived on a quiet Thursday afternoon, buried between appointment reminders and an ad for discounted sneakers. Claire almost missed it. Miss Bennett, I'm investigating the recent leadership turmoil at Street Matthews. Would you be willing to speak on the record? She stared at the message, pulse quickening. Someone finally wanted to hear her story without filters, without boardroom agendas, without the careful phrases meant to protect institutions instead of people. But the idea of going public felt like stepping off a cliff. She closed the email and tried to return to her patient charts, but her hands wouldn't steady. The past months had been a storm, and she'd only recently learned to breathe again. Still, the truth tugged at her like a sleeve. That night, after her son had gone back to his dad's for the weekend, and the house had grown too quiet, her phone rang. A number she didn't recognize. She almost didn't answer. A measured voice greeted her. Miss Bennett, this is Ellen Carver, legal counsel for Street Matthews. I wanted to discuss a resolution that could help all of us move forward. A resolution. Not justice, not accountability, a resolution. Claire listened as the lawyer laid out the offer with clinical politeness. A formal letter stating she was never disciplined. A small payout, nothing life-changing, but enough to help with the mortgage, maybe chip away at her medical bill. And one condition, she could never speak publicly about what happened, not to reporters, not on social media, not to external parties. She would have to help them rewrite the story cleanly, no wrongdoing, no systemic failures, no scapegoat, just an administrative misunderstanding. Claire sat at her kitchen table long after the call ended. The contract lay in front of her, her old calculator beside it, bills fanned out like accusing fingers. She added the numbers twice. Then, a third time. The payout wasn't a fortune, but it was practical. responsible, safe. Her son's college savings needed help. The roof might need replacing in a year or two. The medical debt from her gallbladder surgery still lingered like a shadow. She could sign the paper. She could be done with all of it. If she stayed silent. Her phone buzzed again, this time with a text from her sister, "Thinking of you today. Proud of you no matter what you choose." Followed by one from Michael, sent only minutes apart, as if he sensed something shifting in her. "I will stand by you either way." She stared at the message. The words were simple, soft, but they didn't tell her what to do. They weren't meant to. They were a reminder, whatever choice she made, it had to be hers. Claire picked up the contract again. She imagined signing it. Imagined the relief of a financial cushion. Imagined the silence, swallowing the truth whole. She imagined her name disappearing again, swallowed by a system that preferred her invisible. Her grandmother's voice drifted back to her, words she hadn't thought about in years. "Dignity isn't free, Claire Bear. It costs something." Claire set the contract down. Her hands were trembling, but not from fear. From clarity. She opened her laptop and searched for the journalist's email. Her finger hovered for a moment over the keyboard. This wasn't just about her anymore. Michael had lost his position. Other staff were still afraid. People whose names would never make headlines had spent years working under the same pressure she once bowed to. She clicked reply. The journalist picked up on the second ring. "This is Claire Bennett," she said, voice steady. "Miss Bennett, thank you for calling back." "Have you decided?" "I have," Claire interrupted gently. A breath, a pause, a moment that felt larger than the room she sat in. "You can use my name?" Silence on the other end, surprised, respectful. "Are you certain?" the journalist asked softly. Claire's eyes moved to the unsigned NDA on the table, then to the calculator, then to a photo of her son taped to the fridge, smiling wide, wearing a paper crown he'd made in 4th grade. "Yes," she said. "I'm certain." She didn't offer conditions. She didn't ask for anonymity. She didn't bargain. She simply told the truth. When the call ended, Claire sat back in her chair, exhaling slowly. It wasn't victory she felt. Not triumph, not revenge. Just resolve, quiet, grounded, unshakable. And somewhere beneath it, something else. The beginning of freedom. The NDA fluttered slightly as she opened the kitchen window for air. A winter breeze slipped in, cold and bracing. The contract stayed on the table. Unsigned, unneeded, unwanted. But the question lingered, heavy and unmistakable. When the story goes public, what will come next? The outpatient center sat on the edge of town, where the sidewalks widened into open fields and the sky seemed to stretch a little farther. The building wasn't large, just 2 floors of warm brick and tall windows that glowed like lanterns when the sun dipped low. But it was real. It was theirs. Hale and Bennett Community Care. The letters were simple metal set against the brick, catching the late afternoon light like a quiet promise. Claire paused beneath the sign, letting her fingers brush lightly across the cool metal. Not out of disbelief, but gratitude. Months ago, her name had been buried in boardroom whispers. Now it lived on a wall built not by hierarchy, but by choice. Inside, the lobby hummed with a soft, welcoming energy. Not the sterile, intimidating quiet of hospitals, but something warmer, human. She noticed every detail because she had chosen every detail. The gentle amber lights instead of fluorescent white. The armchairs that didn't scrape against the floor. A bowl of cheap reading glasses, 30 pairs in mismatched colors for patients who forgot theirs. A corkboard already speckled with thank you notes, written in shaky handwriting and crayon alike. "Thank you for explaining things slowly. You didn't make me feel stupid. You made my mom feel safe." Claire touched one card, gently smoothing a bent corner. This wasn't a monument to what she had survived. It was evidence of what she could build. In the waiting area, a copy of the local paper lay folded neatly on the coffee table. She almost kept walking, but something tugged at her. She picked it up. On page 3 there it was, "Whistleblowers clear the record at St. Matthew's Medical Center." Her name, Michael's name. The full truth finally out in the open. She stared at the article for a long moment, her reflection faint in the glossy page. Not triumphant, not bitter, just resolved. On the opposite page in a narrow column near the fold, a headline read, Former executive Kevin Ross faces formal charges. Claire exhaled slowly. Justice didn't erase what had happened, but it made space for what could come next. That evening, she stepped outside just as the sun was lowering itself across the horizon, painting the sky in layers of gold and coral. A soft breeze carried the scent of distant pine and the faint hum of cars heading home. Michael was already sitting on the bench just outside the entrance, a to-go container balanced on his knee. He lifted it slightly when she approached. "Thought you might want dinner," he said. "Or at least dessert." She sat beside him, the bench warm from the day's lingering heat. "Apple pie?" she asked, smiling. Is there any other kind they ate in quiet, the kind that had taken months to grow into comfortable, steady, free of the urgency that had once defined them? The world wasn't crashing down. No hearings, no reporters, no legal counsel waiting behind doors. Just pie and sunset. Claire took a slow bite and leaned back. "You know," she said softly, "there was a time I wasn't sure I'd ever want to talk about any of it again." "I know," he replied. "I wasn't sure I deserved to." She turned her head, studying him in the slanted light. His face looked different now, still lined with responsibility, still marked by the mistakes he owned, but calmer. A man no longer running a race he couldn't win. "Any regrets?" she asked. Michael didn't answer immediately. He set his fork down, brushing a crumb from his lap. "Just one," he said quietly, "that I didn't listen sooner." She nodded slowly, feeling the truth settle between them. "I do too," she admitted, "but they're behind us now." A long breath. A small smile. A sense of something closing and something else opening. Michael looked toward the sign above the door. "You know, every time I see our names up there, it feels unreal." "It feels earned," Claire said. Then, for the first time that day, but not the first time in her life, she intertwined her arm with his. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't a declaration. It wasn't an ending or a beginning. Just a choice. Two people in their 40s. A little worn, a lot wiser. Choosing to walk into the next season side by side, not out of need, not out of rescue, but out of the quiet recognition that dignity grows stronger when shared with someone worthy of it. The sun slid lower, turning the windows of the center into squares of molten gold. Claire breathed in deeply. Peace. Real peace. Not the silence forced on her months ago, but the kind earned through truth, through standing firm, through refusing to disappear. In the distance, a patient waved through the glass doors as she headed home. Claire waved back. A life rebuilt, a story reclaimed, a future chosen. As the world dimmed into evening, a final thought rose gently inside her, warm as the pie on her lap. She hadn't kept her job. She'd kept something far more precious, her dignity, and the right to decide who gets a seat at her table. And tonight, as the sky turned soft and purple, the seat beside her was exactly where it belonged. Sometimes, healing begins where we least expect it. Not in the loud victories, but in the quiet moments when we finally choose ourselves. Claire's journey reminds us that dignity isn't something the world can hand to us. It's something we reclaim inch by inch every time we refuse to be silenced. And maybe the most human truth of all is this: we don't heal by pretending the hurt never happened. We heal by standing in the ruins of what broke us, taking a steady breath and saying, "This is not where my story ends." There is a strange, gentle courage in choosing the harder path, the one without guarantees, without applause, simply because it is honest. And when someone walks beside us, without trying to save us, only to honor our truth, that's when we realize we were never meant to walk alone. May we all find the strength to protect our name, our voice, and the quiet places in us that still believe in better. Thank you for spending this time with us. Stories like Claire's remind us how fragile dignity can feel, and how powerful it becomes when we choose to protect it. If this story touched something in you, a memory, a moment, a quiet truth, we're grateful you stayed until the end. Every like, every share, every subscribe isn't just a button click. It's a way of saying yes to more compassion in the world. It helps us bring more stories that heal, connect, and speak to the heart. Thank you for being here with us.